I was standing in the third-floor conference room when VP Callum Winters told me I was out. Not fired, just out. Off the merger preparation team. The team I'd spent 11 months building the foundation for, back when the acquisition of Futura Technologies was still a whispered possibility in budget meetings. "You think too defensively, Sharon," he said, and he actually smirked. Like he'd been workshopping that line. "We need forward momentum right now. Vision. You're always looking for problems that don't exist." I nodded. Picked up my folder. Walked to the door without a word. He called after me, something about staying collaborative, but I was already in the hallway. You learn not to argue when someone's already made their decision about you in a room you weren't invited to. 3 days later, he came sprinting into my office, the converted storage room they'd moved me to 6 weeks earlier when they optimized floor space, his face the color of expired yogurt. "Why did legal freeze the deal?" he gasped. "What did you do?" I looked up from my laptop. Took a slow sip of coffee. "I didn't do anything, Callum. I was removed from the project. Remember? But you want to know what I actually did? Let me back up. I'd been at the company for 9 years. Not in the spotlight, never chasing the executive spotlight, but I was the person who made sure systems actually worked. Compliance structures. Integration protocols. The boring machinery that prevents million-dollar lawsuits and failed audits. When we absorbed smaller firms, I built the checklists that kept their data secure and their contracts valid during transition periods. When regulators asked questions, my documentation gave them answers before they finished formulating the inquiry. For 9 years, I kept the institution running while other people took credit for leading transformational change. Then Callum Winters arrived. Hired 18 months ago as VP of Strategic Growth. He had the pedigree, top MBA program, 2 successful exits, a TED Talk about disrupting inertia. He spoke in polished paragraphs about stakeholder value and agile pivots. In his first all-hands meeting, he said the company had been too cautious for too long. I knew immediately we were going to have problems. He started shifting people around. Restructuring departments. Renaming divisions to sound more dynamic. My team, Corporate Integration and Risk, got folded into something called the Acceleration Hub. My title didn't technically change, but suddenly I was reporting to someone who reported to Callum instead of directly to the COO. Small move. Deliberate. Then came the Futura Technologies acquisition. A $90 million deal to absorb a mid-sized firm with proprietary logistics software we wanted. Complex deal. Lots of regulatory hoops. Intellectual property transfers. Union contracts to honor. The kind of acquisition that required someone who actually read footnotes. I spent 11 months preparing. I reviewed every Futura contract. I identified 12 clauses that would need renegotiation to comply with our existing vendor agreements. I flagged 6 intellectual property filings that had lapsed and needed renewal before the deal closed, or we'd be buying software we couldn't legally deploy. I built a 40-page integration timeline that accounted for employee onboarding, benefits transitions, and mandatory disclosure periods. Callum never read it. I don't think he opened the file. Instead, he brought in an external consulting firm, Apex Strategy Group, the kind that charges $800 an hour to tell you what your own staff already documented. They gave him a sleek presentation with animated slides about culture synergy and day one value capture. He loved it. Started calling the acquisition our moonshot. Meanwhile, my access started shrinking. I wasn't included in the updated merger meetings. My calendar invites got quietly rescinded. When I asked Callum's assistant about it, she said the meetings were shifting to a more strategic focus. Translation: they didn't want the person who asked uncomfortable questions. 2 months before the planned close date, they moved me out of my office. Told me it was temporary. Facilities needed the space for a collaboration zone. I got reassigned to a windowless room that still had boxes of old marketing materials stacked against one wall. The door didn't lock. The overhead light flickered. When I asked how long temporary meant, I got a shrug. Around that time, I started hearing things. Offhand comments. A junior analyst mentioned that the integration timeline had been simplified to 3 weeks. One of the IT leads told me, confused, that he'd been asked to start prepping server migrations before contracts were even finalized. I pulled up the shared drive. My documentation was still there, but it had been moved into an archived folder labeled Legacy Materials. That's when I went back and reviewed something I'd filed away years ago. A governance agreement I'd helped draft when the company restructured after a bad acquisition back in my third year. The board had been furious that due diligence failures nearly tanked a deal, so they implemented a mandatory review structure. Any acquisition over $50 million required sign-off from the Chief Risk Officer, a role that reported directly to the board, not executive leadership, and that officer had to verify that all regulatory and compliance protocols were documented and addressed before legal could release funds. The company still had that agreement. It was in the bylaws. And guess who the board had quietly designated as acting Chief Risk Officer during a personnel transition 4 years ago, when the previous CRO retired and they never filled the permanent role? Me. They'd never formally revoked the designation. It just sat there in the governance records, inactive but never dissolved. I'd been doing the work anyway, filing the reports, maintaining the compliance structures, but without the title or the visibility. No one remembered. The role didn't appear on the org chart anymore. It had been absorbed into the operational background. But on paper, in the bylaws, I still held the authority. I didn't tell anyone. I just started working. I went back through every document related to the Futura deal. I reviewed the contracts Callum's team had drafted. I found problems immediately. The intellectual property transfer agreements referenced patents that hadn't been renewed. The vendor liability clauses conflicted with our existing insurance structures. The employee retention bonuses violated compensation disclosure rules in 2 states where Futura had offices. I documented everything. I cross-referenced it with federal compliance standards and our internal governance policies. I didn't editorialize. I just built a report that outlined 12 significant legal risks, each one severe enough to trigger regulatory scrutiny or post-close lawsuits. Then I sent it to our general counsel, copying the board's audit committee, with a formal memo invoking my authority as acting Chief Risk Officer to flag the acquisition for mandatory compliance review. I didn't ask for permission. I just did it. That was 2 weeks before Callum removed me from the merger prep team. He didn't know what I'd filed. He was too busy with his consulting firm and their animated slides. He thought he was sidelining someone irrelevant. When he told me I thought too defensively, I knew he'd seen some version of my concerns, probably summarized by someone in legal who didn't explain where they came from. He thought I was being obstructionist. Creating delays. He probably told the executive team I was resistant to change. So he pulled me off the project. Thought that closed the loop. It didn't. Because the general counsel had already forwarded my report to the external legal team handling the acquisition. And they'd kicked it up to the regulatory compliance group. And once that happened, the whole deal went into formal review status. Which meant legal froze all forward progress until the flagged issues were resolved. Which meant Callum's timeline, his day one value capture, his moonshot, ground to a halt. And nobody told him why, because nobody wanted to admit that the person he'd just removed from the team was the reason the process existed in the first place. So when he came running into my converted storage room, panic sweating through his tailored shirt, I just looked at him. Legal says there's a compliance hold, he said. They mentioned your name. What is this? I leaned back in my chair. The overhead light flickered. I filed a mandatory risk review 2 weeks ago. It's part of the governance process for acquisitions over $50 million. You would have seen it if you'd read the integration documentation. His face went blank. You don't have the authority to freeze a deal. Actually, I do. Acting Chief Risk Officer. It's in the bylaws. I sent you the relevant section in an email last year when I updated the compliance protocols. You didn't respond. He stared at me. I could see him trying to calculate his next move. This is sabotage, he said. No, I said. It's my job. The job I've been doing for 9 years while you were giving TED Talks. He left. Didn't say another word. Just turned and walked out. I went back to my laptop. I had 3 more reports to finish. Over the next week, things moved quickly. The general counsel scheduled a meeting with the board's audit committee. I was invited. Callum was not. I walked them through the 12 compliance issues. I showed them the documentation I'd maintained, the integration protocols that had been ignored, the legal risks that Callum's accelerated timeline would have triggered. I explained, calmly and precisely, that if the acquisition closed without addressing these problems, the company would face regulatory fines, potential lawsuits from Futura's employees, and breach of contract claims from vendors. One of the board members, an older woman named Diane Kelso who'd been on the board since before I was hired, looked at me for a long moment. "Why didn't anyone tell us this sooner?" "I did," I said. "I filed the report 2 weeks ago. It went into formal review immediately. But the executive team wasn't informed because they'd restructured communication channels in a way that excluded risk oversight from strategic meetings." Translation: Callum had built a system where no one could tell him no. She nodded slowly. "And you've been handling risk oversight this entire time?" "Yes. As acting chief risk officer. The role was never formally filled after the last transition, but the responsibilities remained. I've been filing the required reports and maintaining compliance structures. It just wasn't visible because the position was removed from the organizational chart during a rebranding initiative 3 years ago." Another board member, a retired federal judge named Walter Krantz, leaned forward. "So you've been doing the work of a C-suite role without the title or compensation?" I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. The meeting ended with the board requesting a full audit of the Futura deal and all related timelines. They also requested a review of how the Chief Risk Officer designation had been allowed to remain inactive without formal oversight. 2 days later, I was called into a meeting with the CEO and the General Counsel. They offered me the formal title, Chief Risk Officer. Not acting. Permanent. With a seat in executive leadership meetings and a reporting line directly to the board. They also informed me that Callum Winters had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the acquisition audit. I accepted the role. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just said, "I'll need my old office back. The storage room doesn't have adequate space for the documentation I need to maintain." They gave me an office on the executive floor. Corner space. Windows. When I moved in, I found a handwritten note on the desk from Diane Kelso. It said, "Thank you for protecting the institution." I kept it. Pinned it to the wall next to my compliance certifications. But let me tell you what happened in the weeks after that initial board meeting. Because the real work wasn't just about getting my title back or watching Callum disappear into administrative leave. The real work was cleaning up the mess he'd created and making sure it never happened again. The board's audit committee hired an independent firm to review the entire Futura acquisition process. They wanted to know how things had gone so far off the rails without anyone noticing. Or more accurately, how the people who noticed had been systematically excluded from the rooms where decisions were made. I spent 3 weeks in conference rooms with auditors, walking them through timelines and email trails. They wanted to see everything, every meeting I'd been removed from, every document that had been archived, every compliance flag that had been ignored. What they found was worse than I'd thought. Callum hadn't just sidelined me. He'd built an entire parallel process that bypassed every governance structure the company had spent years developing. He'd created new approval workflows that routed around the compliance checkpoints. He'd reassigned budget authority so that consulting fees and legal reviews went through his office instead of through the standard vendor management process. He'd even set up a separate project code in the financial system so that merger-related expenses wouldn't trigger the usual oversight alerts. It was sophisticated. Almost elegant, in a deeply unethical way. The auditors presented their findings to the full board. I wasn't in that meeting, but Diane Kelso called me afterward. "He built a shadow governance structure," she said. Her voice was tight. "He systematically dismantled every safeguard we put in place after the Bryson acquisition disaster. Do you know how much money he spent on external consultants while ignoring the internal expertise we already had?" I did know. I'd calculated it while preparing my documentation. $640,000 to Apex Strategy Group alone. Another $200,000 to a boutique law firm that specialized in accelerated deal structures, which apparently meant finding creative ways to skip due diligence steps. Almost $1 million spent to avoid listening to the person who was doing the job correctly for free. Well, not for free. For my regular salary, which was about a third of what a chief risk officer should have been making. The board terminated Callum's employment the following week. Not a resignation. Not a mutual parting of ways. Termination for cause, which meant no severance package, no stock options vesting, no golden parachute. I didn't celebrate. I just noted it and moved on. Because here's what nobody tells you about these situations: winning doesn't mean everything suddenly gets better. It means you get to do the actual work without someone actively sabotaging you. That's it. That's the prize. And the work was substantial. The Futura acquisition had to be completely reconstructed. Every contract needed review. Every timeline needed adjustment. I brought back the integration protocols Callum had archived and started from scratch. I also had to rebuild trust with the Futura leadership team. They'd been dealing with Callum's chaos for months: contradictory timelines, last-minute changes, requests for information that didn't make sense. Their CEO, a sharp woman named Catherine Wu, had started making quiet inquiries about backing out of the deal entirely. I called her directly. Introduced myself with my new title. Explained that there had been leadership changes and that we were restarting the integration process with proper oversight. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you the person who's been sending the detailed compliance questionnaires?" she asked. "Yes." "Good. Those were the only documents we received that made any sense. Everything else felt like corporate theater." We talked for 90 minutes. I walked her through the revised timeline, explained the regulatory requirements we needed to address, and answered every question she had about how the integration would actually work. At the end of the call, she said, "I feel better about this than I have in 6 months. That's what proper process does. It doesn't slow things down, it prevents catastrophic failures and builds actual trust." While I was rebuilding the acquisition structure, I also started paying attention to the people Callum had left behind. The other casualties of his strategic vision. There was an analyst named Terrence Park who'd been on my original integration team. Brilliant with data modeling, cautious with projections, always asking the right questions about edge cases. Callum had reassigned him to a low-visibility operations role after Terrence pushed back on some unrealistic revenue forecasts. I pulled him back onto the merger team. Made him my lead analyst for financial integration. He sat in my new office, still not quite used to the windows, and said, "I thought I was done. I thought I'd wrecked my career by pointing out that the numbers didn't work." "You didn't wreck anything," I said. "You did your job correctly. The system just wasn't rewarding correct work for a while." There was also a contracts specialist named Yolanda Herrera who'd been pushed into early retirement discussions after she refused to sign off on a vendor agreement that violated our conflict of interest policies. She was 58, had been with the company for 22 years, and was considering just taking the retirement package rather than fighting. I called her into my office. "I need you back," I said. "Full-time on the Futura integration. And I'm going to make sure those retirement discussions disappear from your file." She stared at me. "Can you do that?" "I'm Chief Risk Officer. I report directly to the board." "Yes, I can do that." She came back. Within 3 weeks, she'd identified 8 additional contract issues that would have exploded post-acquisition. She worked with the same quiet competence she'd always had, and this time, people listened. I started building a new team. Not from scratch, these people had always been here. They'd just been buried under Callum's reorganizations and reassignments, hidden away in roles that didn't use their skills, waiting for someone to remember they existed. Now they had visibility. Now their work mattered in rooms where decisions were made. And slowly, methodically, we fixed the Futura deal. 3 months after Callum's termination, the board held a special meeting to review the acquisition status. This time, I was invited to present. I walked them through the corrected timeline. Showed them the resolved compliance issues. Explained how we'd rebuilt trust with Futura's leadership and renegotiated the problem contracts. I also presented a supplementary report on the costs of Callum's approach versus the costs of doing it correctly. His method, $840,000 in consulting fees, plus an estimated $3 to $5 million in potential regulatory fines and lawsuit settlements if we'd proceeded as planned, plus unmeasurable reputational damage. My method, $120,000 in additional legal review costs, for extra months of timeline, 0 regulatory risk, and a functional relationship with the company we were acquiring. Diane Kelso looked at the numbers for a long moment. "How did we let this happen?" she asked, and I knew she wasn't really asking me. "Charisma," I said. Callum was good at talking about vision. He made caution sound like cowardice and process sound like obstruction. And organizations want to believe that someone has a shortcut, because shortcuts sound efficient. But there are no shortcuts, she said. No. There's just work. And when you try to skip the work, you create disasters that cost more to fix than the work would have cost in the first place. The board approved the revised acquisition timeline unanimously. They also voted to formalize the Chief Risk Officer governance structure, ensuring that the role could never again be quietly disappeared from the organizational chart. Catherine Wu and I signed the final acquisition documents 4 months later. Clean contracts, clear timelines, zero outstanding compliance issues. On the day the deal closed, she sent me a bottle of wine with a note, to actual professionals. I kept the note. Put it next to Diane Kelso's. A year after Callum's departure, the company held its annual leadership summit. I was on the executive panel for the first time, sitting at a table with the CEO, the CFO, and the COO. The moderator asked us about lessons learned from the past year. The CEO talked about the importance of governance. The CFO discussed financial oversight. The COO mentioned operational resilience. Then the moderator turned to me. "You've had an unusual path to the executive team," she said. "What would you say to people in the organization who feel like their work isn't being recognized?" I thought about that storage room. About the archived folders labeled legacy materials. About all the people like Terrence and Yolanda who'd been doing critical work in the shadows while someone else took credit for strategic vision. "Keep doing the work," I said. "Document everything. Know the rules better than the people who think they're in charge. And understand that institutions have long memories, even when individual leaders don't." I paused. The room was quiet. Eventually, someone's going to need what you know. And when they come to you, panicked, asking why everything just stopped, you'll have the answer. Because you never stopped doing the work, even when no one was watching. The applause was polite. Professional. But afterward, a dozen people came up to me. Junior analysts, mid-level managers, people I'd never met. They all said some version of the same thing. "Thank you for saying that." I thought I was the only one who felt invisible. I was about to quit. I gave them my email. Told them to reach out if they ever needed someone to review their documentation or validate their concerns. Because here's what I learned: the system doesn't fix itself. It gets fixed by people who refuse to let bad leadership destroy institutional knowledge. By people who keep the receipts and know when to invoke the rules everyone else forgot existed. Callum thought he was building something new. He thought caution was the enemy of progress. But he was wrong. Caution isn't the enemy of progress. It's the foundation. And when you try to build without a foundation, everything collapses the moment reality shows up. So here's what I want you to take away from this: if you're sitting in your own converted storage room right now, wondering if anyone notices the work you do. They don't notice. Not yet. But that doesn't mean the work isn't happening. It doesn't mean it isn't essential. Keep the documentation. Maintain the structure. Know the bylaws better than the people who think they're in charge. Because eventually, someone's going to come running into your office, panicked and sweating, asking why everything just stopped. And when they do, you're going to look up from your laptop, take a slow sip of coffee, and remind them that you tried to tell them. They just weren't listening. But the institution was. And the institution has a long memory. 2 years after taking the Chief Risk Officer role, I'm still here. Still reading footnotes. Still building the boring infrastructure that prevents disasters. My team has grown. We have proper resources now, proper visibility, proper respect. When I flag a risk, executive leadership stops and pays attention. Not because I learned to speak in buzzwords or because I became more charismatic. But because everyone remembers what happens when you ignore the person who actually knows how things work. Last month, the CEO asked me to sit in on the interview process for a new VP of Strategic Operations. They wanted my assessment. Wanted to make sure they weren't hiring another Callum. The candidate was impressive on paper. Stanford MBA, 8 years at a top consulting firm, polished presentation skills. He talked about velocity and impact metrics and cutting through red tape. I let him talk for 20 minutes. Then I asked him one question. Walk me through how you'd handle a situation where your timeline conflicts with a regulatory requirement. He blinked. Smiled. Well, that's where creative problem solving comes in. There's usually a way to find flexibility in these frameworks if you know where to look. And if there isn't flexibility? I asked. If the requirement is absolute? Another smile. Slightly less confident. Then you bring in the right expertise to find a path forward that satisfies everyone. But what if satisfying everyone isn't possible? I pressed. What if following the regulation means missing your launch date? He hesitated. I could see him recalibrating, trying to figure out what answer I wanted. I suppose you'd have to adjust the timeline, he said carefully. That's correct, I said. You'd adjust the timeline. Not the regulation. After the interview, the CEO asked for my thoughts. He's smart, I said. Good communicator. But he thinks regulations are obstacles to negotiate rather than boundaries to respect. He'll spend 6 months trying to find clever workarounds before he accepts that some rules exist for reasons that matter more than his schedule. We didn't hire him. The person we did hire was someone with half the pedigree and twice the practical experience. Someone who'd spent 15 years actually implementing integrations rather than advising other people on how to do it. Someone who, when I asked the same question, said immediately, you follow the regulation. Always. And you build your timeline around that reality from day one. She starts next month. I'm looking forward to working with her. Because here's what I've learned in this role, the most dangerous people aren't the ones who are malicious. They're the ones who are charismatic and convinced that their vision matters more than the structure holding everything together. They believe their own narratives about disruption and innovation. They genuinely think that caution is cowardice and that rules are for people who lack imagination. And they do enormous damage before anyone stops them, because they're very good at making skepticism sound like negativity and due diligence sound like obstruction. My job now is to make sure we catch them before they build shadow governance structures. Before they spend $1 million avoiding the advice they're already paying for. Before they convince everyone that the person asking questions is the problem. I've also been working on something that matters beyond my own situation. A governance training program for mid-level employees, the people who do critical work but lack positional authority. The people most likely to get sidelined when someone like Callum shows up. The program teaches them how to document their work in ways that create institutional memory. How to identify which policies and bylaws protect their roles. How to escalate concerns through proper channels when normal communication breaks down. How to recognize the difference between legitimate leadership and performance art. Diane Kelso loved the idea. She allocated budget for it immediately. Said it was the kind of institutional resilience that should have been in place years ago. We ran the first session 3 months ago. 40 people attended. By the end, a dozen had specific questions about governance structures in their own departments. 2 had already identified potential compliance gaps that needed attention. One woman, a project manager in operations named Claudia Vance, came up to me afterward. She'd been with the company for 6 years, consistently excellent performance reviews, never promoted above her current level. I've been trying to tell my director about a procurement process that violates our vendor conflict of interest policy, she said. He keeps saying it's fine, that everyone does it this way, that I'm being too rigid. After your presentation, I checked the policy manual. It's not fine. It's explicitly prohibited. What do I do? Document everything, I said. Every time you raised the concern, every response you got. Then file a formal compliance report with my office. Include the policy language and the specific violations. I'll make sure it gets reviewed properly. She filed the report 2 days later. Thorough, detailed, cross-referenced. Exactly the kind of documentation that makes my job possible. I forwarded it to the Compliance Review Board. They launched an investigation. Turned out the procurement process she'd flagged had been running for 3 years, costing the company preferential pricing on contracts and exposing us to potential vendor litigation. Her director was reassigned. She was promoted to senior project manager and given authority over procurement oversight in her division. The institution protected her because she knew how to invoke the structure. That's what the training program does. It arms people with the knowledge that their work matters and the tools to prove it when someone tries to tell them otherwise. Because here's the thing about places like this, they're not inherently good or bad. They're systems. And systems respond to whoever knows how to operate them correctly. For 18 months, Callum operated the system incorrectly but convincingly. He made it look like he was driving progress when he was actually dismantling the machinery that prevented catastrophic failure. He got away with it for a while because charisma persuades and few people read governance manuals. But systems have their own logic, and eventually that logic catches up with anyone who thinks they're above it. I didn't take Callum down, the system did. I just knew which levers made it pay attention, and now I teach others where those levers are. That's the real work, not removing one bad leader, but building cultures where institutional knowledge matters, where governance isn't mocked, and where uncomfortable questions are understood as safeguards. It's slow, unglamorous work. But it's the work that prevents disasters. Last week, a stranger emailed me. She'd been sidelined, her documentation archived, her role marked for elimination. "Did you really stop an acquisition?" she asked. "How did you know you could?" I told her the truth. I read the governance manual. Every page. And I kept doing my job correctly even when it wasn't visible. 3 days later, she wrote back. She'd found a clause protecting her role during restructuring, 5 years old, forgotten, but enforceable. Legal confirmed it. Her termination was halted. That's teachable. Replicable. That's how institutions survive without heroes, by relying on people who understand the machinery and refuse to let it be bypassed. You can have charisma, credentials, momentum. But if you don't understand bylaws, contracts, and regulatory frameworks, you're performing leadership while someone else runs the organization. And one day, they'll invoke a clause you didn't know existed and stop everything cold. Callum's at a startup now, posting about disruption. I hope they have a good lawyer. Because eventually, something will break, and they'll need someone who kept the documentation and knew the rules. If that's you, the cautious one, the footnote reader, the person told you're too defensive, you're not wrong. You're just early. Keep going. The institution remembers.